Today, I'm speaking with Wes Cockx, one of my favorite 3D designers and a creative director based in Brooklyn. He's worked with some of the biggest names in the industry: Google, Deepmind, Microsoft, Github, you name it, he's probably worked with them. And you've probably seen his style if you work in tech. It's used a lot these days, not just because a lot of people employ Wes, but because this abstract realism kind of thing has been catching on over the years as Microsoft has made it more popular with Nando Costa and all of that kind of work there. And I wanted to get behind that and understand one of the key artists involved in this area. And Wes, again, is at the forefront of this. So we talked about his early design journey, his journey into 3D, early rendering experiences with long render times, all the way up to his current process, his workflow, the way that he works and finds clients. And the thing that I found really inspiring and refreshing is just how non-perfectionist Wes is in certain areas, how it's just sort of part of his process to experiment all the time. And that is what he's known for. Many of his clients will come to him and say, hey, can you do something like this that he's posted on X at some point in the past? I think it's a great position to be in. Wes was really kind of giving me his time. I really enjoyed the interview. And as always, if you guys have any feedback about the interview, the kind of guests that you want to see on, or if you just want to connect, please reach out to me on X. I'd be happy to connect. And yeah, I hope you enjoy the interview. So the first question I want to ask you is about your first render. When was that? Do you even remember that? What software was it on? What project was it for, or was it just you playing around?
It was definitely me playing around. I come from like a classic graphic design background where there was not much software involved. Like I moved afterwards into like the branding world. Did that for about 5 years. It was mostly Illustrator and Photoshop. I was absolutely horrible at it. I never enjoyed a single moment doing that. But while I was working there, I learned a lot of skills. I learned a lot of software, and I was kind of messing around on my own in 2D back then in doing more illustration. Started like freelancing on the side. I mean, I don't think it's even worth the word freelancing. Like I did a few projects for like local, like friends, local businesses that were probably also friends. But that was more, I felt more comfortable in that. And then at some point I started seeing 3D like in like ad campaigns and everything. And I was like, this does not look like it's done in Illustrator or Photoshop. So probably started Googling around a little bit, and like everybody started with some trials, definitely illegal downloads back then of the software. I can't remember which ones that I remember I tried Modo back then and a few other ones, but then I think like the third software, the fourth software that I tried was Cinema 4D, and that one kind of clicked with me immediately. It's probably also because like I think even back then, it's like this is, I think like somewhere between 10 and 15 years ago, there was already quite a lot of good like basic tutorials on YouTube for Cinema 4D. So I just kept messing around with it, having no idea what I still think that very often I have no idea what I'm doing in the software. There's a lot of buttons that have been there longer than I have been in Cinema 4D. I have never clicked them, and I will probably never.
I wonder how many buttons there are in Cinema 4D. Be interesting to count.
Yeah, exactly. No, and it just like that one kind of clicked with me, and it was really fun. So I think for a few years, every day when I finished my design job, my actual job, I came home, I had dinner, and then just started playing around with it. I never tried anything else than Cinema 4D. I mean, I played around and like drifted off in Houdini a little bit, but I don't want to call myself a Houdini artist. Like, I use it more as probably the most complicated plugin for Cinema 4D, more like an extra tool bag, but I have never rendered a single frame in Houdini. Like I always bring everything into C4D. back then in the beginning, it was just, I think it was already called standard render, that I played around with a little bit. Then I remember, you're on message boards and talking with other people, and like the grown-ups were using V-Ray back then, so I got V-Ray. I think I used it for like maybe like 2 years. Like I have to admit, like I did not know what I was doing. I have no idea how I used V-Ray for 2 years because it was way too complicated, I remember. But I was just like, I kept clicking things, and when it worked, it worked. Like my render times were absolutely horrible back then. And then you started hearing and reading and seeing more of like GPU rendering real time. I think I did like a freelance job on site for like about 3 months, and the guy sitting next to me was working with Octane. And I think like after a few days I was like, okay, I need to figure out how to buy and how to hook up a GPU to my machine so I can switch to GPU also, which I did.
Can I jump in there and ask a little bit about what you mean by real time, especially back then? Like, because that's a term that's used in different ways. I'm interested how you're using it.
Yeah, so for example, let's go back to V-Ray. I don't know, I assume they have real-time rendering now also. I'm not sure. But back then, you would literally look into your C4D viewport. You would be working on materials and lighting, putting them on there, but you would not see it until you hit the button render, like we do now for a final render export. So
Right, okay.
this meant you had to, it was just a difficult learning curve also, because you did something, you have to hit render. Back then it was like, I mean, I could go for a walk and do errands while I did a low resolution render on my poor machine back then. And then you see something's wrong, so you stop it. Again, you're adjusting things and you have to do it again. So with real-time rendering, it's kind of, you see the render in real time. It's low resolution at first, like as long as you don't touch anything, it keeps rendering and keeps getting a cleaner image. But the difference is that one slider that I had no idea what it did, in real-time rendering, maybe the standard setting is on 1. So I could put this on 0 or on 10 or even 10,000, and I would almost instantly see what that slider actually does. Because I don't mind diving into manuals, but manuals in general are just very dry. And like there's a lot of technical terms. There's nothing better than to just touch something and immediately see. It's like a volume button. Like you go to the left, there's no volume. You go to the right, it's gonna blast out of your speaker. So that's sort of the same feeling, but with 3D.
So let me jump into a topic I was going to touch on later, because I think this is really important and kind of the heart of 3D as I see it, is that that iteration loop and how difficult sort of slow render times can affect what it is that you're doing. So obviously back then it was slow. Nowadays you're primarily Redshift, you're doing huge projects, you're doing long video sequences with obviously which have many frames per second. So there's a lot of render power behind that. Could you give just an overview of roughly how that works per project? Are you using render farms? Do you have a whole team of people who do it with you? Give us an idea of that kind of pipeline.
I mean, my current machine is pretty powerful. There's two 4090s in there. So for still imagery, I just render everything in house. And when for example, when I have to do a final render, maybe it's 8K, and that might be a 25-minute render. In my head, I am actually complaining about the render times, but then there's moments where I actually realize it's 25 minutes for an 8K image. While 12 years ago or 15 years ago, I was rendering probably a 750 to 750 pixels square low resolution, and I would hit render in the evening, and in the morning when I got up, I would walk over my computer like this, just hoping that I didn't make a mistake. So it's come a long way with still imagery. I always, unless it's like a very short turnaround where I have to, let's say, render out 38K images between now and tomorrow morning, I gotta deliver them, then I will send them to the farm also. But for still imagery, I think 95% of the time I just render it myself.
So something like the, I know there was a long project, a very quick turnaround project that you had for Bing Chat, I believe it was. Were you working with other artists? Two questions. Were you working with other artists during that time? And was that the same process? Were you just sending it to a render farm from where you're sitting now?
So with that one, was a little bit a unique situation, because they came to me and they said, like, we have this project, you would be perfect for it, like your style, you can really do your thing, the whole thing. Then it was, at the end, it was like, there's one catch, we're launching in 2 weeks. So in 2 weeks also means, like, I don't hit render in 2 weeks. Like, in 2 weeks, it all came back from the farm, it's edited, it already went through the studio that was making sound design, and a client most of the time needs at least a few days to just prepare their stuff. You can't send that video 2 minutes before they're launching. Like, they need a little bit of time to use it on their platforms and like change it for different types of usage. With that one, so I'm just gonna take a step back. Like with how I work is just me working solo, but I have a small team of freelancers that I've been working with for like the past 4 to 5 years, and it just depends on the type of project. Like I love, on one hand, let's say, flying solo on a project, but I also love taking charge of like leading a team for, like, usually those are bigger projects, obviously. With this one, again, it was very unique because, again, those 2 weeks, so we had like maybe a week and a few days of production time. Obviously, you gotta cut in the creative also. Like, we didn't have time to go do R&D for a week because we didn't have that week. We didn't even have like 48 hours to do that. So with that one, we just started making still frames, and just with the client constantly back and forth and like signing off, and like the client also knew, like, whatever we sign off, we can go back on that. Because it's like, we're not gonna make it. So with that one, I was doing still imagery for just the graphic style and everything. There was one person who literally did nothing else for 2 weeks than to animate the UIs in After Effects that we would bring in afterwards. Usually with a motion project, we send to clients, especially in the beginning, like the first motion, usually it's just rendered as a hardware render, which means there's no materials, there's no lighting, because even on a low resolution render with Redshift, it's still gonna take like some time. While with like a hardware preview or like a wireframe, it's almost instantly. Like, you can render 2 minutes of animation, depending on what you're doing, in just in even under 2 minutes. So we were sending that to the client together with the animated UIs, together with the still Redshift imagery, just still frames. Because the client actually never saw, or none of us actually saw, the final product, because we didn't have time to do low resolution renders. I'm sure I did like a few very short tests, like 5 or 10 seconds, and I was like, okay, this is fine. Just fingers crossed, and worst case, we're not gonna sleep one night to redo one. Um, that one was very fun because it started with getting a message. I can't remember. It was like an email or a text message from, "Hey, can you do this?" To 2 weeks later, we were literally standing on Times Square here in New York, and the video was playing there. That we were saying to each other, "Did we just do this?" And like the project was already in our portfolio. The invoice was already paid by then. Not an unimportant thing also. It was just very fun. Just there was a lot of momentum. And momentum is something that can sometimes just kill a project.
Too much momentum or lack of momentum?
No, the lack of momentum.
Okay. So
Yeah.
maybe we could talk about a very different project in terms of the length of time that you worked on it, but that didn't die of lack of momentum, that was just more in depth. Maybe more of the typical kind of project where you have like a designer involved, there's more of a sort of back and forth between you and the client. I guess for those who aren't in the field of work that you're in, what does the typical like process look like from client's idea to final render?
I mean, it always depends. Sometimes a client comes to me, they have prepared a deck where it's like, we just need to agree on details, sign the paperwork, and I can start working on this tomorrow. Like, I know what you want, you know what I do. But then on the other hand, sometimes a client comes to me, we love your work. We got this thing, do things for it. Like, we want you to, where it's very open. And there, in that case, it kind of also splits up into two possible results of it. One is where a client actually means that, where they're like, the project really grows. It's like I do a lot of R&D, it goes back and forth with the client, and we get into a very specific thing for the project. But then on the other hand, sometimes I have a brief like that where a client is, we love your work, do your thing. And I do R&D for a week or 2 weeks, and I send it to them, and they will immediately say, we like it, but actually what we were thinking about is this thing. So it just depends a little bit, but I think most projects usually start with some R&D, even when it's very defined what a client wants, because usually they give references. Sometimes it's a different project from the same client. Sometimes it's from another client. Obviously, you just can. I get that there's always inspiration and references, but like purely copying things is just something that I've always tried to avoid.
And you have a lot of you publish a huge amount of experiments as well, and I imagine that I imagine that a lot of people know your work when they come to you. That's basically what you're saying. So it's not like you have to reinvent something from scratch with them, that you're already sharing a visual language maybe before you even speak to them for the first time. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, I got into this very lucky position usually that like I have a lot of my own experiments. I think this started, I never had a moment where I was like, I'm gonna start experimenting with things. I think this literally started from that beginning period that we talked about earlier, where I was making random things, and sometimes these things it's inspired by something I see. Sometimes it will literally be me watching a tutorial and finding a new technique, or just stumbling onto something, or very often there's a lot of those things also that was R&D from a project that just got wiped off the table, where I was like, I really want to explore that one more. But I always kept doing that and made sure to always publish them. And I got into this situation where let's say like 80% of the time when clients come to me and there's like references in the deck, that most of it comes from that, which is a pretty fun thing to do. And then very often I have to dive into a file from 3 years ago where I'm thinking like, I have no idea how or just the file doesn't, when you open it, something's changed in the software, a newer version, and it just doesn't work anymore. But it's nice that it still happens sometimes where I get a brief that the page with references literally looks like another person's portfolio. That I'm like, they're nice people. Like I've spoken with them. Were they too expensive that you come to me? Yeah. So sometimes it still happens.
Yeah, I remember it. And I had a small period of time in the world of film music, and I remember that being the bane of many composers' kind of lives, is the temp track that the editor uses. They just get so used to using Hans Zimmer or whatever it is in their edit that when it comes to the time when you get to the brief, it's a different thing with the visual style, because that's the main thing. But with the underscore, there's a sort of a funny one. But that is a great position to be in. So I want to talk a little bit about that style. I've heard it described, because you see it quite a lot. You are like at the forefront of defining it in with clients like Microsoft and Google and Google DeepMind. I've heard it described as abstract realism when you're bringing the UI or like abstract UI. Like, how would you describe the whole range of kind of styles in your output?
I mean, I think I always liked the term abstract realism. For me, what I always like, first of all, like people that do like hyper realistic 3D rendering, like this is not me talking down on them. It's just for me personal. I think it's amazing. Like it's mind blowing. But for me personally, I'm not interested in making something super realistic. Like I'm more of the idea. I know sometimes for clients there's no other option than to do things in CGI. But for me it's always like, for example, the perfect description of this is I have stickers that I hand out to people, and on the back side of those stickers is my website, and the tagline is "Reality is boring." That I'm like, why would I try to recreate something hyper realistic like this mug that's standing in front of me? I can just take a picture or look at it. But again, this is not me talking down on people that do hyper realistic stuff. I think for me it's more, I like finding that balance, like right in the middle between something abstract and real. I always liked, like especially with materials, like make something abstract, like something imaginary, but then with the materials put elements in there. A simple example, like put a fingerprint on there or some scratches on the edge, that it's like, I love when people look at my work that it's like, it looks very surreal, but on the other hand, it looks like kind of real enough where I can imagine touching it, or like I can imagine how it feels. I always find that interesting that people often say, like when I post some of those experiments or my work, that they say, I want to touch it, or like I want to squish it, like it looks soft or it looks very hard. It's very, very interesting how people interpret those things.
So let's talk about Redshift and rendering in general for people, because I'd love you to talk about why that's your primary renderer and has been for a while now. Is that right?
Yeah, I think like about 5 years. I think
And before that was Octane and yeah, okay. Yeah, I'd love to just hear you like brainstorm or spitball about why it is that you love Redshift and haven't moved elsewhere, and how it's affected your work. Feel free to be specific about what it does, but just maybe explain more of the nuanced topics for non 3D people.
I mean, between Octane and Redshift, I think I'm now as long in Redshift as I was before in Octane. I think I did Octane for like 4 years, and I'm about 5 years in Redshift now. And I know it's like this big conversation and debate still, which is the best one, and why this one is not good and why this one is so great. But I think first of all, it's kind of like that old school conversation between the cameras Canon and Nikon. my dad always used to say like, it's just preference. What do you like using? But obviously, the reason why you like using one of the two render engines, that's for you the reason why you don't like the other one or you think the other one is not as good.
Yeah, and this question should have been rephrased. It's definitely not meant to be like a comparison. Like, please, but I'm not saying please defend
No,
your
not
use
at
of it.
all.
I'm like interested for people to understand what, because I love Redshift so much, and I'm just scratching the surface of it. And I'm interested for someone like yourself who has so much expertise in it. Like, why is it that you love working with Redshift?
Um, I mean, I loved using Octane always. Like I learned that was also my first experience with real-time rendering. Like that's where I actually started to learn about rendering. Um, I loved using it, but I moved into this thing where like I said about like the abstract realism in materials and like my favorite thing is like if the manual says like these two things do not hook them up together, like that is my cue to actually go in the software and like I still want to see what it does. It literally works always, but it's just a metaphor for slowing your computer down usually. And with Octane, I came to this point where for me personally that I was trying things and I had ideas and technically it should work, but then sometimes it would work. Then the day after I opened the scene and it would just be broken. I had no way to fix it. I think for me the big thing that I immediately noticed after like a month of testing Redshift was just the stability. And again, like I'm not saying Redshift is perfect. Like I can give you a laundry list of things that little bugs that have been in there longer than I've been using Redshift that I'm like, how can this not be fixed or why doesn't this work? And Redshift absolutely crashes. But I think for me it was more the stability especially and like being a little bit longer in it, what I realized also, because you have more stability, you can do, I feel like I can do more in Redshift, like I have more options. Like again, 5 years have passed now that I have not seen or used Octane. There's also 5 years of progress there. But for me, just Redshift was just the thing that worked for me, and I think yeah, I don't think I would switch anytime soon.
So let me ask about both your skill set and your tools. So we've got Cinema, Redshift. I know you use Substance, I think. And are you modeling in things? Are you modeling entirely in Cinema, or are you using things like plasticity? Or what other tools are you using?
I have the plasticity, I think now for 2 months in my download folder. One of these days I'm gonna install it and play around with it. I do all my modeling in C4D. Yeah. I'm one of those weird people that actually enjoys modeling. I think most people say I'm not saying I'm the best, but I've always enjoyed modeling and trying to figure things out. What I also found is when you model something a little bit better, you're probably gonna thank yourself a little bit later when you're doing like more complex materials because you have the control over it, while something that's thrown into the volume measure and the Z remeasure afterwards, you're gonna get what you get. And I'm not saying like I use those things all the time, but it just depends for what. But when I have the time, usually like I just model. I do that in Cinema 4D. And I think apart from that, like you said, Substance, the one that I use the most is Substance Designer. What's the other one? I've used a little bit of Painter, but I think it's just my style is not. I think Painter, I feel that whenever I use it, that it seems like an amazing software when you're using something like ZBrush, more in like the sculpting area of 3D. And apart from that, I think one of the things that I could never miss anymore would be, what are they called, Rism UV, which is just a software to do the UVs, but the doing UVs inside of Cinema 4D is just, I'll just keep it very friendly towards Maxon and just say I don't get it.
So you're using a separate software for that?
Yeah.
What's it called again?
Rism UV. And this is another one of those softwares. I am pretty sure I am not using as much as 5% of what the software can do, but it just like UV unwrapping is just amazing in there. It's like they have a great bridge between C4D and Rism. So I literally had, like, I select geometry, I click the Rism button, and my geometry opens in Rism. And when I save, it closes down, and I have my same geometry in Cinema 4D with a UV tag on there.
I got to try this because, yeah, UV wrapping is definitely the thing that's blocking me right now.
Yeah.
Moving forward, it's it feels really awkward. So that's great to hear from someone like yourself. On that note, I'm interested whether you have any, again, being friendly to Maxon, are there any other areas of cinema that you feel are like frustrating or lacking or could do with like focus from the development side of things?
I mean, it's really nice, all the new stuff they've been adding the past few years. Like, I use a lot of it, but I feel like we're at a point now, like, all those new things are really nice, but they feel like 60% production ready at best. Some of them are, I think the one that's probably the most advanced now is like the updated simulation system. But they've been adding so many things the past few years that I always wonder, like, where's the update to this? Like, the last thing we got was, I think, the particle system. But we have all these new systems now, and I feel like there's a really big lack of them communicating with each other. And some things are just confusing to me. Like, there was like the scene nodes were introduced, I think, like, this might be like 3 or 4 years ago by now, and I feel like the official statement on those is like, hey, these aren't production ready, this is just like sort of a beta. Well, I'm like, we're 4 years later.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, I'm like the MoGraph system is still absolutely mind-blowing, and I use it every day. But I feel that one lacks a little bit of like some updates in there. Like, all the procedural stuff would be nice to have some new things in there. And I know that some of the scene nodes are working with that system, I think. I've played around with it a little bit. But I think it's just a lack of things communicating with each other and like fine-tuning what we have now instead of just add a new thing. And I know, like, there's nothing more flashy than adding a new thing to something, but a lot of those things, the result is because they're just not there yet. Like, for example, if I have to do something with particles now today for a client, like, I will not use the particle system in C4D. Like, I will do this in Houdini or with other plugins like Xparticles or something. Because, like, I feel even when I'm experimenting with these things for like my personal work, where it doesn't really matter all that much, like, if I can't do something yet with it or just don't figure it out, I can like go into a little bit of a different direction with things, or just remove it completely or do something different. While when you're working for a client, you can't really say like, oh, I can't do this because the software can't do this. Like, it sounds like an excuse. I think that's one of the biggest things. But I know it's very hip to talk down software these days, and like people are complaining about different software packages. You can never make it perfect, and
I mean, especially with the huge behemoth programs like Cinema or like After Effects, there is just so much interdependencies. I don't even know whether that's the right term for it. Like, choosing how to allocate development resources to keep things up to date and also to keep up with the market changes. It must be so difficult. But that's really interesting to hear. One quick question I wanted to ask was about, in my workflow, I've never done this between 3D applications. I've only gone to like compositing, like in After Effects. How do you, in a nutshell, bring something from Houdini to Cinema or this to there and that to there? How does that work? Is it like, does it get rendered and then you overlay it in some way? Do you share 3D data, or is it just, for example, the particles or some of the kind of like growth, kind of plant-like stuff I've seen in your renders? Like, is that done in Houdini and brought over?
I mean, but when I bring things over from Houdini, I think the one, like, because like I mentioned, like I don't do any rendering in Houdini. Like usually this will be an alembic file. Sometimes I will break down the alembic, so I just have the geometry or whatever I need in there. It depends a little bit. And like, I'll be honest, my workflow between going from Houdini through Cinema 4D, the best way to describe it is probably trial and error and having to Google a lot of things. I think the big thing that I often struggle with is like some of the attributes. Like Houdini is so good in creating attributes from your geometry and motion that you can use that you can use for materials or for other things in Cinema 4D, and that's always one. It's probably because I don't spend enough time in Houdini that I always struggle with, but I have like a few helplines, a few friends that are more fluid in Houdini than me. They can usually help me out, and there's always the old school message boards where you can find a lot of details.
Yeah. So it seems to me that like the experiments that you do regularly are really the heart of everything, both from your kind of, or very integral to everything that you do, both from like getting clients to developing your voice and your style, and also to improving and getting better. Would you say that that's fair? Yeah.
Yeah, I still really enjoy like learning new things and like doing tutorials, and sometimes it's funny like when I'm in a project that's taking up like 100% of my, or like a few projects that are in production and they're taking up like 100% of my, let's call it my 3D time, and like I'm not doing any experimenting, I will say to my wife, like I wish like tomorrow everybody would leave me alone and I can just do random stuff tomorrow. But on the other hand, she also laughs with me because tomorrow, sometimes it just happens like tomorrow I deliver this project and there's nothing lined up for another 2 weeks. Like half a week later after delivering that, I will start complaining about like, I want to start working on client stuff again.
Yeah. It's the chasing the illusory balance. There's never going to be balance.
Exactly.
How long would you say, although it changes obviously if you haven't got client work, would you spend experimenting per day or per week?
Well, it really depends. Like if I have like a full week like waiting for the next client project, like I'll probably use that to catch up on like portfolio projects, just preparing them even though I might not be able to share them just yet. And I think most of my time go I always say like when people ask me like how much time do you spend on this, it's just like the time that I have, because I know there's a lot of people doing like the daily renders. Like I never really did that. If I'm doing daily renders, that's because I just have the time at that point, while I just got out of like 2 long big projects. In the meantime, my wife and I were moving apartments also. So I think I started experimenting like about 3 weeks ago because I had some time again. I think there was almost a gap of like 2 months before that I didn't do. It's just when I have the time for it, and it's also when I have like an idea, because I learned that also throughout the years. Like sometimes you sit at the computer, like you open your software or whatever you do, even if it's painting, and like you can't force yourself to come up with something. Sometimes 30 minutes later, I'm like, I'm just gonna close this and do something else because it's not there at the moment. While on the other hand, you can be walking on the street and get an idea, or be in this project that you don't have time for the next few weeks, where I'm like, you just keep thinking about it. I think inspiration just comes when it comes.
So there's no like processes or habits or routines that you go to when inspiration is very much not there. Like on a tight turnaround project, I'm interested like how that happens. Like on the Bing chat one, like how do you find inspiration if it doesn't turn up on something
I
like that?
mean, usually when I have a project, how do I say? Like, let's say somebody comes to me. We have 10 subjects here. These are like I get the explanation for it, maybe some references, and like during that first read through of the brief or just the first talk or the call that I have with the client, from those 10, I'll probably immediately, one of them is like, oh, I can do this, is actually perfect for this. So you got that idea, and like you sort of get to the middle with having ideas for it. And there's always like maybe one or two that I'm like, Jesus, I have no idea what to do for this. But I've learned also, like, don't keep staring at that one that you haven't figured out, because you have three ideas that you know what you want to do, or just you know which direction you want to go in. And usually I just jump onto those that I have ideas for, and then it kind of grows. And there's always this one where you're like, I have no idea what I'm gonna do for that one, but I think eventually you figure it out.
And I'm interested in this, particularly with your line of work, like with the idea of like representing concepts, often for technology or like abstract ideas and stuff like that. And I just had Evan Abrams on, and we spoke a lot about this idea of the literalization of concepts. When you're doing motion design, you can be very overt and obvious. It's like, this is the concept of whatever. But often your stuff is like playing around the idea. It's not like saying this is the thing. Could you talk a little bit about that space of exploration, like how literal and how like abstract you go? And yeah, I'm interested in that and how you think about it.
I mean, I go like myself personally. I'll go in both directions. I think it's like, again, like it depends on the inspiration or the ideas I have for it. What it eventually turns into is also how open-minded the client is about this. Because I've had it before where let's take like the Microsoft Fluent project, where I think it was like about 24 subjects, and there's a few of them in there where you're like, I would understand that people would say to me like, yeah, you're just making it up. Because like, if you're not telling me that this is, I don't know, shapes and forms or sound, yeah, once you tell me, once you feed the idea into my head, then like I see it. Well, on the other hand, there's clients that love going into that direction, but I've also had it where a different client comes to me and they will reference, for example, the Fluent project, and they say, hey, we have these 10 subjects or 20 subjects. This is the list of them. And I do really abstract things. There's clients literally asking me to put the word next to it. Like, I get it also. Like, the companies just have different profiles. Like, since we were talking about Microsoft, I think for some products or platforms within Microsoft, like Fluent is the best example. because Fluent is like a design language. It's not like a product that you can get a subscription to. That can be a little bit more open-minded, and I think also like Microsoft has the experience to, how do I say this the right word, like to have the guts to go very abstract sometimes, while at the moment I'm working with a client which is, they're not a startup, they've been around for a decade, but this is a team like 4 or 5 people, while they might be a little bit like more reserved about things. How do I say, like, no, we really need to see the word in there, or like the name of the product that we're doing, just because we need people to realize that it's us. And like this is not, there's no wrong, no good or bad, but I think it just depends on the client a little bit also. Like I'm all for going full into abstract, but I'll be honest, like I've delivered projects in my life where the client really pushed me to be abstract, and I was like, if the client didn't tell me, oh, this is what I see in what you just did, then I wouldn't see it myself. That's an exception though.
What was it like working with Deepmind? Because can you explain a little bit about what the project was there?
I remember how that project started with Deepmind. The idea behind it was, if you go to a stock website, or it probably changed in the past few years with the whole explosion of AI being so popular, that like, let's say 5 years ago, when you saw an article in the newspaper about AI, it was always like this blue neon-ish brain with a chip in there, or like the absolute classic is like a human hand and a robot hand shaking. So, and then also like if you, me too, like 5 years ago, if you would have asked me like, what's the first thing you think of when I tell you the word AI, it's Terminator. I think AI in Hollywood is always been like a very negative thing, and like it's like the computers and robots are taking over the world, and like it was always that same image, like that same cold image of like a robot hand and a human hand shaking each other's hands. And what they wanted to do is just commission artists to move away from that, and just have like, if you need something about artificial intelligence, we have an open source library that everybody can just use. And the briefing, or just the way of working, was very, very interesting. So what they did was actually, instead of, there was actually no brief at all. For example, there was just, these are your 2 subjects. So you get a subject, and instead of them briefing you, they were like, we hired you because we love your work, how you interpret like subjects and things. And instead of like giving you a brief and boundaries, we were all matched up with an actual scientist that was a specialist in that subject that we had to visualize. So that was literally, I know there was one person, she was in Los Angeles. I spoke with another scientist that was somewhere in Europe, I can't remember. And like, they would talk to me, give me a presentation about things that go way over my head, obviously. But it was very nice to like just hear somebody speak about it that's very passionate about their job. And then we just did the interpretations from we were allowed to follow up with questions, and that's actually how that came. It was a very organic process. And I'll be honest, the first time when they reached out to do that one, when they explained me like, we're not going to brief you, you're going to talk to a scientist for 30 minutes and then we're going to let you do whatever you want. That's a major red flag for me usually. when a client says like, I love your work, just do whatever you want. Usually those are the situations, but yeah, it's been every time we're working with the Deepmind team, that it's been an amazing experience.
How do you work with music and sound? Because that's like really, really core to all of your video projects. Are you involved in that? Do you have a particular collaborator or collaborators?
I mean, it depends. Sometimes a client makes the edit from my animations and gets in contact with a sound studio or a sound designer themselves, and that's where I usually don't have anything to do with like the creative of the sound. While on the other hand, sometimes I hire a sound designer myself, and it's something like I usually just let them, how do I say, like by the time that I send over something to a sound designer, I'm probably close to being finished with the project. So there's like a certain vibe. What I do, I kind of explain what the project is, what's it gonna be used for, kind of like use the briefing that I got in the beginning, and then I write a little bit extra just about where we ended up. Like I love letting a sound designer just doing their thing. I think maybe some things that I sometimes do is like be mindful to not do this. How do I say? I have a very good example because I'm working with a sound designer at the moment. I just finished a project, and there's in the project there's a certain element that is representing the human, like the user. It's a very abstract element that just always comes back throughout the whole film. But so we had the idea to actually make one sound, like a sound identity for our user and our person. And I remember saying in the beginning when I explained it, when we do this, like this is the user. So this is gonna sound silly, but like I told the sound designer, since this is the user of the platform, maybe let's not use a sound that makes it sound very hollow. If that makes any sense. So things like that I will do, but apart from that, I just try to let them do their thing. It's also a very special feeling to like work on a project for 4 months. You have, let's say, 2 minutes of animation. It's fully edited. You send that to somebody and you get it back and you put your headphones on and the sound loud and just like see your own work, often with a fresh set of eyes because you haven't been working on it yourself for a few weeks. Yeah, it's always an amazing feeling to just because your thing really comes alive. It's really cool to see always.
In unexpected ways, I imagine. Like, there's two things that are coming to mind right now. Like, as I mentioned, I used to be involved in film music, and I loved how it was like this invisible brushstroke that could just change the emotional tone, the texture of so much, the pace. But I think particularly with motion, where it's like obviously things in motion is the sort of primary storyline. There's even more with sound design. Like you can I watched this video, I think it was only this morning, from Veritasium on YouTube, about how if you see two circles going like this past each other, they look like they're going through each other. But as soon as you add a pool cue noise, it looks like they bounce off each other. It was a really, really interesting example. So I'm just, does it often surprise you, or does it bring out visual elements that you never you didn't look at in the same way before?
Yeah, absolutely. I find it very interesting. Like I deliver like, let's talk about just like one specific scene, and like something is happening there. I probably stared at every pixel in that scene for months. Like I know everything that's going on there, but sometimes you see it with sound afterwards. And it's this little detail that you would never notice, but with sound you can just put a magnifying glass on there. even if it's like this little springy motion of something, you can use that and make it sound like a gigantic spring, and it just emphasizes things in there. Yeah, it's always super fun. I think people underestimate or just don't realize very often. It's not just like you 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 get a sound clip and you slap it on there.
Yeah. I think it's one of the most underestimated things in any
Yeah.
for all motion designers in motion design education. It's so that's really interesting to me. Is there any particular video that you think would be good to play to people to give them a real sense of this, like something that you've done where the sound and music was particularly?
I think the one that I remember was I probably watched it like for the rest of the day on loop with my headphone on. Was the project that I did for Google Material, because I had absolutely no say in that one. Like my first time was just like somebody else. Like I didn't even see the edit yet, because that project there was actually no motion in the project. It was just still imagery. So that's how we started the project. It was a very experimental project. There weren't even subjects. I literally just got a Figma file with a lot of buttons and UI elements, and I think the only rule was that I was not allowed to use the Google colors. And I don't know, at a certain point we ended up where we actually ended up with the project, the still imagery. And then we were saying like some of these, it would be super fun to like do a little bit of motion, and like I started playing around with it, I shared it. And then it was like, how about we do this one? And then at some point, like I think like a month later, it was like, we actually have like a minute and a half of motion. So let's just edit them together and hire a studio to do the sound design. And yeah, it turned out amazing. But I remember that one, that was a collaboration with Nando Costa, that I was walking on the street the moment when he sent it to me, and I almost just ran home. I was like, I am not gonna listen to this the first time on the street on my little shitty speakers in an iPhone. Like I want to see this on the big screen, full screen, with the sound on.
So you mentioned Nando. I'm interested just briefly in kind of some of the inspirations or the people who you really admire in your industry. Can you give us a couple of names or people that you think would be interesting for people to check out?
I mean, for anybody who's never heard about Nando Costa, it's definitely a very good name to look up. Like I'm very happy and lucky to have collaborated with him several times, but like I've always just been a fanboy of his work. I think it's amazing what he did at Microsoft. Like I think Nando is not just Nando. There's probably a few other people, but I think Nando is one of the reasons why we see all this 3D, and like that Microsoft has like its own like 3D visual 3D identity. Working with him is absolutely. I can't really complain usually about clients, but like working, I have a lot of favorites, obviously, like everybody. There's just people that you connect with to work with, and I think what made Nando special for me always is when he comes to you for a project, like he's coming for you. Like he's not gonna come and like, hey, this is some super cool stuff that Tendril did or this other designer, and like, can you do the same thing? It's literally with the Fluent project. I think the briefing, even though that was just such a gigantic project, the briefing was literally a one-page PDF, and there were just, I think, like 10 or 20 subjects on there, and we just started experimenting, and he's like, working with him is like collaboration in the truest form I always found. Because I can't remember which one it was specifically in the Fluent project, but I think it was the one for sound that I did. There were like 3 or 4 very different ones that I was doing during the R&D phase, and I had my absolute favorite, which was, let's say, the third one, and Nando replied immediately, this first one, it's absolutely perfect. And then at some point I mentioned to him, like, I like the third one, and he was like, but why do you like it? And we started talking with it, and eventually we went with the other one in the project. Like, usually it's not that common with working with a client. When a client says like, this blue ball here is a red square, then it's a red square. If you know what I mean. Like, the client is always right. And like, again, I'm not complaining about my clients. Like, I don't really have anything to complain with. Just as an example, with Nando, you really get the feeling that you're collaborating with somebody. Like, usually, and I don't want those projects to end. Projects like that.
Do you share his kind of interest and explorations with AI? Is that any part of your process, the sort of like German stuff?
That is where we do not overlap, I'm afraid.
Yeah. So we don't need to go into that because that's a whole nother topic. I'm interested in like what because he kind of, as far as I can see from afar, he uses that part of his sort of his edge, his creative edge, like where is my style going? Where is our style going? I'm interested both from a technical point of view and a kind of visual point of view, like what's next for you? How are you exploring? You mentioned sometimes it just comes to you when you're walking out, but are there deliberate forms of inspiration or like references that you are working with all the time or finding?
I mean, just to like quickly go on to AI, like in my workflow. I mean, like everybody, I think it's about 2-3 years ago when all of a sudden, I think it was Midjourney, it was called.
Yeah, today is actually the first day that they have the web open beta, actually, yeah.
So just like everybody, I think I started reading and seeing everything about it. My first idea was obviously like, I have to check this out, and then like, should I be worried about my career, my work and everything? I started playing with it, and I think like I know it's come a lot further than what it was when I was playing around with it. But I was like immediately like, it's not gonna replace what we do. On the other hand, I was like, it kind of made me exciting about like, how can I use this? I experiment. My first idea was maybe I can create like texture maps to use in my 3D materials and everything, but at least back then I had to spend so much time in Photoshop actually extracting usable texture maps that I was like, I could have done this a lot faster with just going straight into Photoshop or just using procedural elements inside of Cinema 4D. I think for me also, the thing that I love the most, or just the reason why I'm doing the job that I'm doing, is because I love being creative and coming up with a solution. And like, absolutely, I've seen AI things that probably also inspired me to do something else, and that look very impressive. But then in the end, I'm like, I don't find, from my point of view and what I do, I just can't be bothered. Like I have such a feeling of quantity over quality with AI, or just at least like the image generating. And like I've seen that there's like things for video also. There's obviously also the big issue or question. What are all these things trained on? Because like I think all of them have the nicest words, but I'm pretty sure everything is in all of them. And it's also, I'm not gonna spend time fighting things or putting silly things on my website that supposedly prevents those platforms of grabbing stuff from my website. I love being creative. I'm very happy and I think very lucky to make a decent living out of that. So I want to keep being creative. So maybe I'll give it another try at some point to like see if I can put it anywhere in my workflow. But on the other hand, what's it called? ChatGPT. Like I'm not a native English person. It helps me a lot to sometimes you like rewrite some words that I wrote for a deck or an email. I like more the practical things in AI. Then I don't understand. It's like a lot of the AI is being built for all the fun stuff that we can do as humans, if that makes any sense. Well, I'm like, why don't we focus on those things that are all very boring for us and like nobody likes like tedious jobs?
Yeah, how to make AI practical. Yeah. So what's next for you? You mentioned you're on a project right now. I'm interested also, like, what's your edge? What are you experimenting with, like technique wise or skill set wise?
I just finished up a very big, I think like the biggest project from the past few years was like, I think a little bit over 4 months that I worked on this solo full time. I think it's gonna be, I can't really give any details about it at the moment, but I'm very excited to be able to share that. I think like in a month, maybe 2 months or something. I'm working on some other projects now. It's funny, like I literally can't say anything else about, like I'm working on things. I have some things lined up for afterwards, but that usually.
What are you experimenting with then, if you can't say anything about the projects? Like what?
Like I said, like I'm doing my experiments. One of these days, I'm sure I'm gonna install plasticity. If I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. And starting to play with that because it looks really fun and handy to play around with. And apart from that, I have a whole bunch of tutorials that I would love to get through one day. And once in a while, I also just like to walk away from the screen in this room. So it's good to do some other things also.
Yeah. Last question, who are some of your favorites for people to learn from? You mentioned about the lots of tutorials that you need to get through.
I think I usually like I always have like one or two people on Patreon that I'm subscribed to. Usually I float around between like different people, and because like I don't have the time to do it like every week or every month. So like I see something there and I go backwards to another person. I think. Let me quickly check. So, I think Subframe Studio is I think his name is Nikolai, or let's just stick to Subframe Studio. He has an amazing one. I know in the very beginning, like maybe 5 years ago or something, when Vincent Schwenk just started his Patreon. I think I was subscribed in the beginning. I've been seeing a lot of super fun stuff there that at some point when I find some time, I would love to go back in there and learn from him also.
Yeah. Great, Wes, thank you so much for coming on. It's been great chatting with you and appreciate you taking the time.
Likewise. Thank you.